On a noonless morning that felt older than the century itself, the river answered to a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow sound. The cypress trees stood like judges in a courthouse of rotten shadow, their branches hanging with Spanish moss that moved as if in sympathy with some private grief. Across the water, a single leather pouch lay open on a crumbling plank, salt-glazed fingers spilling like full rosary beads into a wet, black world. This is not history told from a safe distance. This is the shudder beneath the floorboards of a nation, a truth the respectable would rather leave buried. If you want to walk this path with us, subscribe now, and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Your location will map the silence we break together. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Listen closely, the man whose hands we will follow through mud and murder carried trophies in his pocket. He kept them like prayers, like pledges, like proof that the world owed him something it would never willingly pay. His name is James Copeland, a name that tasted like iron in the mouth of anyone who knew the Pearl River's moods. You will try to humanize him, to pin his crimes on poverty or passion, on a hard childhood or bad companions. That is what the living do to soothe themselves. But the ledger of Copeland's life will not permit comfortable explanations. Each act he committed was a deliberate incision, a small surgical undoing of other people's futures. We will begin where he began, with a single human finger wrapped in cloth and tucked into a leather pouch, as if to say, "I have measured the cost of a life and found it small. Step closer." Let the air grow colder. Let the river show you how quickly a respectable face can hollow into something else, into an instrument. This is not merely a story of violence. It is a study in identity and the precise moments a man decides to become someone else, to taste power like blood. Watch him become what he wanted to be: feared. Listen, remember, fear the name. Pearl River County in the 1840s demanded a hardened body and a quieter heart. The swampland taught its children to carry suspicion like clothing. The water held the record of things men preferred to forget. James Copeland grew inside that grammar, hands that learned to fell a tree and mend a fence before they learned how to restrain an impulse. His father, Samuel, worked the bottomland with a steady patience. His aunt Prudence kept a small household of prayers and thrift. James read more than most, and he worked with a speed that made people trust him. He seemed destined for the plain trajectory of a farmer's life: marriage, labor, harvests, until a single morning tilted the ledger. A traveling merchant vanished near a low bend in the river. The man's horse was found riderless, saddlebags torn, coins scattered like testimony. The county murmured of bandits and bad luck, and men rode off to comb the marshes. Copeland joined the hunts with an eagerness that later men would mistake for civic duty. He had learned where to look in the reeds, how to interpret the soft cascade of mud and leaves. There among the cattails he found a broken body and a ring finger that would not be missed for long. He cut the finger from the corpse with the dispassion of someone completing a practical task. He wrapped it in cloth, as one wraps a lesson learned, and slipped it into a pouch. At first he rehearsed reasons: identification removed, suspicion deferred. But the act brushed something primitive, an ownership, a ledger kept not on paper but in flesh. He kept the coins. He kept the knife. He kept the finger. The difference between theft and a trophy is the way the holder tells himself a story, and Copeland learned quickly how to rearrange a story until the world fit his appetite. Neighbors praised his industriousness, while the cellar where he stored the pouch grew thicker with secrets. He imagined himself as someone entitled to weigh life and death, to tally losses, as if cruelty were a currency he could spend. James's courtship with Elizabeth Hartwell had the polished cadence of a performance, public enough to show virtue, private enough to conceal fractures. Elizabeth's steady gaze and careful manners belonged to a family that valued appearances like property. Judge Hartwell approved James as if signing off on a land sale. Then a fog morning unsettled those plans. Calvin Richardson, a traveling merchant, vanished near a bend in the river. His horse returned alone, saddlebags torn and coins scattered like demand notes. The county bristled with talk of thieves, and men rode off to search the marshes. Copeland went too, with an intensity that read like helpfulness and something colder. In the reeds he found Richardson, leg broken, eyes panicked as he begged for rescue. The choice was raw and immediate. Carry the man toward a doctor and risk discovery, or hide the body and preserve a life of comfort. James felt survival press against conscience and, in a moment he would later try to explain away, silenced the merchant by covering his mouth until the breath ceased. He took the gold, the knife, and more crucially, Richardson's ring finger. He wrapped the digit in cloth and kept it in a leather pouch beneath a loose floorboard. The removal was practical, he told himself. Identity erased, suspicion diverted. But it also conferred something on him, a sense of definite power, a physical tally of what he could take. The coins greased his family's farm improvements. The preserved finger greased his imagination. Where others entered grief and stepped back, Copeland found a current that smoothed the moral edges. Over months, his choices accumulated into a method. The river's hush became a witness to small, deliberate cruelties, each one softening resistance to the next. He practiced a new habit when he slept. He counted the faces of those he had wronged as if enumerating crops. By day he smiled with a domestic ease that made suspicion improbable. By night he handled knives and string and salt with the meticulous attention of a craftsman building a terrible altar, rehearsing small violences that would someday require a larger canvas and then more. The scent of piety did not cleanse James. When Reverend Augustus Fleming stayed at the Copeland farm, reading scriptures by the hearth and speaking of charity, the house filled with a temporary light. The preacher trusted easily. He carried donations for a distant church and spoke of mercy as if the world still answered to it. James offered to show him a shortcut through the swamp, an intimate kindness that masked intent. They walked together in morning fog, and the conversation trailed harmlessly until a remoteness swallowed the preacher's steps. James felled him with a blunt strike when no one watched, a heavy branch delivering the first loud crack. He finished the act with a knife. Afterward, among the damp reeds, he amputated the preacher's index finger and wrapped it in salt to preserve it as a memento of command. That removal felt less like concealment and more like a rite. Every finger in his pouch was not merely a forfeited identity, but an offering to a new sense of self. If the first killing had been a desperate calculus, the second felt like entrance into a profession. He volunteered for searches with zeal that proclaimed innocence, and the community saw only a helpful man. In the dark he arranged his trophies with a strange tenderness, as if each severed tip were a book he read to understand his power. Rumor, always hungry, began to sniff at his footsteps. In the criminal undercurrent of the river parishes, stories of mutilation moved faster than official dispatches. Gideon McCready, an outlaw with a rope beard and a voice that had bargained away conscience, took interest. He watched the pattern and saw in Copeland the combination of local knowledge and moral flexibility that could be weaponized. He tested alliances, measured how far James could be pushed. Their meeting was less recruitment than collision. McCready offered muscle and access. Copeland offered roots and a respectable face. Together they would make the river a trap. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Their partnership became a choreography of ambush and counting, a deliberate cruelty that spread its shadow over the floodplain. They carved patterns on maps, river crossings staged as accidents, travelers guided into pockets of silence, familiar faces used as bait. Each raid taught economies of savagery, how to strike and vanish, how to cultivate fear until it did their bidding. The Southern Belle steamed up the Pearl one humid morning with the casual arrogance of commerce, cotton bales, merchant cargo, and passengers leaning toward the rail. A family with a child at its breast, a traveling salesman with a satchel, men arguing softly over prices. Ordinary pieces that convinced a community it was safe. Copeland and McCready chose such ordinariness because trust hides like skin. Their gang waited in a marshy braid where a pilot might cut the corner and drink the shade. The attack was quick and terrible, surprise screams, steel flashing, ropes and bodies dragged into reeds. Copeland moved through the wreck with the composure of a man who knew how to direct suspicion, calling for searches, tending the wounded in ways that made him appear humane. In a captured cabin, he worked with a surgeon's calm. Fingers were taken with the procedural accuracy he'd learned at an index here, a ring finger there, each removed cleanly, salted, wrapped. The pouch beneath his floorboard grew heavier and more eloquent. News spread and towns shuttered routes, mothers kept children inside. The Hartwells heard the tremor of danger, and Elizabeth's admiration curdled into careful watchfulness. James's public smile remained steady. He escorted Elizabeth to church, offered comfort in the pews, while at home a darker man rehearsed his reserve, answering questions with a single turn of the head. Judge Hartwell used his influence to press for more patrols, but the river's labyrinth made investigations slow and evidence fragile. The respectability around Copeland, pending marriage, church attendance, visible grief, acted as armor. When suspicion neared, he stepped forward with a show of contrition, and the county chose his visible sorrow over the unsettling possibility of a neighbor's guilt. The pouch taught him new verbs: conceal, arrange, repeat. He began to see victims as variables and severed fingers as notations in a ledger that guided his next move. They widened their prey: lone traders, preachers, and those deemed unworthy became targets. Marcus Kellerman, a slave trader, stopped to repair a wagon and accepted James's false shortcut. Kellerman suffered. His middle finger was added to the collection, and James pried gold teeth from the corpse's spoils. He rationalized these acts as cleansing the county of predators, converting moral disgust into currency and letting the swamp's silence justify his hand. Every theft tightened the net of his growing empire. Not every victim was chosen for ease. Sometimes the calculation required cruelty on a broader scale. When Marcus Kellerman's party left the Copeland farm, a wagon of people bound for sale, James saw a problem and a solution at once. The human cargo presented witnesses who could trace Kellerman's last steps. Witnesses meant questions, and questions meant risk. James guided the group deeper into swamp than necessary and left them to a geography that demanded loyalties of its own. Without food, water, or a map, most did not survive long. A few escaped, 3 made it out and were later recaptured and sold elsewhere, their stories dismissed as tales of flight. The abandonment was a clinical decision, collateral to the larger project of preserving his anonymity while accumulating wealth. Each such action insulated him, because the more chaos he seeded, the less likely anyone would find a single trail pointing back. Sheriff Thomas Bullock found himself caught between the limits of law and the cunning of the river. His jurisdiction was vast, his manpower limited, and the area's terrain acted like a natural accomplice. He increased patrols, he questioned travelers, he interviewed neighbors with the blunt patience of a man trying to knit together a pattern from tatters. Yet each inquiry seemed to bounce off the river's skin and fall apart. James played the part of the diligent volunteer, aiding searches with a specificity that only deepened the county's inclinations to trust him. Elizabeth, sensing a change she could not fully name, pulled back into a polite distance. Her letters, once filled with warmth, grew cool and measured. She asked questions that James deflected with small domestic gestures that suggested guilt was improbable. Within Copeland's inner life, a darker ritual had become embedded. The pouch was now a text of his identity. To open it was to read his own capacity for violence. The fingers were less trophies than grammar, marks by which he learned how to compose the next sentence of atrocity. He moved through town wearing a mask of neighborly grief, and at night he tended his small, meticulous reliquary, learning how not to feel and how to make grief more marketable. The river taught him patience, and in that patience his crimes became not impulsive eruptions, but a sustained career of precise destruction, administered like plantation labor. Power, he discovered, tasted better than fear. As months turned, the valley learned to live in a new rhythm: daylight commerce and an anxious hush at dusk. The river's communities spoke in guarded notes, travelers added detours, and a hush at tavern tables meant more than prudence. Copeland's name began to surface in whispers among those who traded in rumor, and Macready's gang grew bold, taking not just money but the power that comes from the deliberate humiliation of another. They adjusted their theater: a friendly face at a dock, a disputable shortcut, a trustworthy hand extended to lead someone out of the road. Their victims dissolved into the landscape of absence, and families found only fragments: a ringless hand, a set of gold teeth, the quiet that follows sudden loss. This pattern created a climate in which institutions frayed. Local magistrates argued over jurisdiction, messages were sent to adjacent counties, reward posters quietly appeared tacked to poles. Bullock, the sheriff, felt the squeeze of public fear and private politics. He gathered a ragged group of deputies and trackers and pushed deeper into the maze. They caught some of Macready's foot soldiers, small men who left behind enough foolish evidence that they could be followed. And those captives told lies and partial truths that hinted at a larger enterprise. The testimonies were messy, but they were also the first time officials heard a description of a man who moved among the respectable and kept trophies in a pouch. The idea seemed absurd, so it was suppressed like a rumor that tasted of madness. Meanwhile, James's interior life altered in ways more profound than the town's gossip could capture. He learned to externalize risk. He kept one face for public grief, another for domestic ease, and a third for his private reckoning. That private reckoning became ritualized. He salted the fingers after each murder with attention and then catalogued them, aligning them on dates, circumstances, and the feelings they elicited. The act of categorizing reduced murder to an administrative exercise and, in his mind, allowed him moral latitude. Each incision was a notation toward survival. Each preserved fingertip a ledger entry that justified the next expenditure of cruelty. Elizabeth's letters now seldom spoke of delay and a distance that could not be bridged by excuses. His engagement, once assured, hovered uncertain like a moth around flame, and the community's trust thinned to a fragile film and fear. The economy of terror has weak seams. Pride and carelessness pull at them until they open. The gang's confidence made them careless in small ways, an overlooked footprint, a cry heard by someone with a memory, a loose word in a tavern. One night, after a botched raid in which a woman survived to tell of a familiar face guiding a stranger into reeds, threads began to unravel. The survivor described a man whose gait she recognized from the Hartwell estate and the Copeland fields. When the whisper reached the sheriff, Bullock doubled the pressure. He tightened patrols and placed informants in taverns, using men who could speak the criminal language without being suspected themselves. The pressure made Macready nervous. He had built his empire on uncertainty, and now his partners looked like liabilities. In a moment of self-preservation, one of Macready's lieutenants talked, or perhaps traded allegiance for mercy, and described the existence of a man who kept human digits salted in a pouch. The confession, when it reached official ears, was so grotesque that some dismissed it as coerced fantasy. But Bullock's deputies, pushed beyond denial, set a trap. On a grey morning, they approached the Copeland farm with a search warrant and a calm that belied their nervousness. James met them with the composure of a man trained to perform innocence. He answered questions, he opened gates, he offered explanations. The deputies found nothing immediately. Then, beneath a loose board, a leather pouch appeared with the dark pearls of preserved tissue inside. The discovery was the collapse of a private mythology. James Copeland did not flinch as they removed the objects. Perhaps by then he felt removed from ordinary feeling. He was taken into custody quietly, the sheriff aware that the county's appetite for spectacle could turn to mob violence if handled badly. Word spread like oil on river water. Neighbors who had broken bread with him watched as men led him from his doorstep. The Hartwells heard gossip turn to indictment. Elizabeth's retreat hardened into disbelief, and then into sorrow, a private grief that could not reconcile the man she thought she knew with the one in chains. Type, the veil is broken twice in the comments. The arrest answered some questions and created new ones. How had so much slipped past, and who else had been part of that ledger of fingers? Finally, once inside the jailhouse, the machinery of explanation began to wear. Cells have a way of turning small truths into larger ones, because in confinement a man has nothing left but language and memory. Bullock's men questioned James with a persistence that chewed away at excuses. At first he offered denials and the plausible narratives of a man who had been in the right place at the wrong time. He gave the accounts competent people wanted to hear, a helpful farmer, a neighborly face, misinterpreted coincidences, but the rope of inconsistent details tightened under confronting testimony. From a former accomplice who saw the pouch and from a survivor who recognized James's gait. His composure began to crack like glazed pottery struck from the inside. He confessed not in a grand collapse, but in a series of small admissions, each one delivered with the flatness of someone reciting what must be said. He described removing fingers to make identification impossible, described using salt to preserve them for years, and described the leather pouch that he had carried like a private reliquary. He named victims, places, and dates with the chilling clarity of a man who had practiced memory as a ritual. Newspapers, when they arrived, smelled of ink and outrage. The courthouse, always a theater, readied itself for a performance of retribution. Juries listened for stories that can be ordered into law's neat boxes. Copeland's narrative did not fit neatly into mercy or madness, and that unsettled jurors more than monstrous simplicity would have. In the cell between interrogations, he sometimes spoke not to his interrogators, but as if to himself, tracing the moments in which he decided to trade solace for certainty. "I kept them," he said once, "because then I knew the world had given me something." The county's respectable citizens found this both arcane and terrifying. It suggested people could, if they chose, become small gods of decision. For families of the missing, the confessions were a terrible relief. Naming meant closure of a kind, even if it arrived wrapped in salt and the quiet of a river that would not give everything back. The trial would need to decide whether punishment or understanding should prevail today. A trial in a county square is more like a ritual than a debate. Crowds assemble, lawyers marshal narratives, and the law insists on an order that flattens nuance. Copeland's hearing became a furnace of attention. Prosecutors leaned on the gruesome physical evidence. The leather pouch, the preserved digits, the forensic logic of wounds inconsistent with accidental death, and the testimony of survivors and accomplices whose stories formed a mosaic of horror. The defense, predictably, tried to contain what it could. They argued coercion, argued the plausibility of mistaken identity, argued that a man so enmeshed in local life could not possibly be the architect of such prolonged atrocity. They even raised questions of sanity, seeking to move the narration from malice to madness so that mercy might tread where punishment would otherwise fall. These legal frames tried to convert moral complexity into categories the jury could hold. But law, like a shallow river, cannot always reach the depth of human motive. Witnesses recounted dinners at the Copeland table where James had laughed like any hospitable host. Others described the meticulous salt preservation process, a detail that made the crimes tactile and inhuman. Elizabeth's testimony, whether as a reluctant witness or a frustrated partner, carried a particular weight. In the courtroom, she seemed both estranged and entranced, a person who had trusted and been betrayed. For many in attendance, the trial confirmed an awful truth. Evil is inside the same rooms as ordinary goodness. The jury took the evidence, the anger, and the fear into a closed room and wrestled with it as if it were a living thing. There were no easy boxes to place Copeland in. He was not a monstrous caricature removed from humanity, nor was he an irrational beast beyond culpability. He was, to the jury and the public, a neighbor who had quietly acquired the capacity to choose violence, and that choice made him fully liable in law's eyes. When the verdict was announced, the sound that swept the courtroom was not just a legal pronouncement, it was the audible collapse of a community's innocence. Appeals were brief formalities. The legal system, confronted with gruesome efficiency and overwhelming testimony, moved toward a sentence that matched public appetite. People came from miles to watch the punishment, not for justice alone, but for a sense of closure that violence can sometimes offer it. The sentence arrived with the inevitable weight of ritual death by the state's mechanism, announced and scheduled. In the cell that would be his last public room, Copeland moved through a different kind of choreography. Prisoners find new routines when the end is visible. Small acts of order, a turning of days into predictable tokens. He spoke to visiting clergymen in tones that suggested both calculation and a desire to be understood, confessing facts with the slow clarity of someone cataloging inventory. To a priest he said that the fingers had been both tool and testimony, an attempt to instrumentalize his crimes into meaning. To the sheriff he admitted, with a flatness that unsettled, that he had felt no exaltation as much as a cold confirmation. Each removal had confirmed his power. Journalists, when allowed, recorded his words with an avidity that blurred any attempt at moral introspection into spectacle. Families of the victims attended the readings of his statements with a brittle satisfaction. Some prayed aloud, others watched with the hunger for explanation. In the weeks that followed the sentence, the county set about correcting its own complacencies. Patrols increased, river routes were more closely watched, and a wariness settled into the customary greetings. But the cultural shock remained. How could a familiar man hide such a ledger? The answer, partly, lay in the community's unwillingness to see the contradictions in their own public life, the way respectability can be used as camouflage. Copeland's last days were not silent. They were noise with meaning, confessions, letters, remonstrations. He wrote sometimes to Elizabeth in a hand that trembled, at times coldly resigned, and at others pleading. She wrote back with a mixture of denial and hurt, addressing a man who had been both beloved and monstrous. The legal apparatus moved him toward the gallows, and as the date closed in, ordinary things took on a clarity that prior life had denied: the color of the sky, the sound of a horse's hoof, the way the river ran past without the knowledge of what had been beneath. Often he sat by the barred window and recited, one after another, the names he had taken them from, as though pronunciation might convert a ledger into sorrow and render some arithmetic intelligible. In the end, Copeland's personal geography, his farm, his pouch, his rituals, became evidence for history. The day of execution is a distillation of a community's appetite for closure and a nation's appetite for spectacle. Crowds arrived early, folding into a rhythm of gossip and stone-faced anticipation. Carriages lined the approach. Children were hidden behind skirts. The gallows, when erected, looked small and official, as if the law had shrunk even its instruments to seem legitimate. James Copeland, dressed in a sober coat, walked with a composure that made some think he met his fate with dignity. Others saw in his steady gait the final insolence of a man who had learned how to perform. Clergymen read scripture, jurors watched with the stern attention of men who had done their duty, and families of victims stood as if on a small tragic stage of public mourning. Copeland's last words, spoken into a hush that was almost reverent, were not the defiant roar some expected, but a measured, curious assertion. He told those listening that the river remembers what men do, and that memory is weightier than law. He asked forgiveness from the living and offered, in the tremor of a voice, what looked like an apology. Whether it was performance or genuine, no one could tell. Performance and sincerity had long since commingled in his actions. The rope did its grim work, and the sound that followed was both silence and absolution for those who needed it. But silence does not erase pattern. The arrests and sentences that followed Macready's network did not fully dispel the sense that something institutional had enabled these crimes. How many men had been content to look away because it spared them discomfort? How many doors remained closed because opening them required implicating the respectable? The law had performed its function, yet the moral ledger of the region had been rewritten. Some mourned the loss of innocence, others felt relieved that ordinary life could resume. But ordinary life, once marked, never returns to its old smoothness. It bears the scar of what was permitted and what was hidden. Years later, families gathered in local churches to say the names. Parish boards carried simple plaques. Historians argued whether punishment equaled justice or merely satisfied a crowd. And the river continued, indifferent and keeping a private tally. Memory is an architecture built by those who survive. It selects and arranges what will be seen and what will be omitted. In the decades after Copeland's fall, the Pearl River Valley tried to tell itself a manageable story. Pamphlets and local histories emphasized the sheriff's courage and the triumph of law, making room for the narrative that the community had rightly corrected a deviant. But stories have rough edges, and the edges reveal the seams. Some citizens quietly admitted they had noticed oddities and chosen not to speak. Others could not reconcile the existence of a neighbor who had sat at the same table with the brutality that later emerged. The case became a lesson in how institutions and reputations can be weaponized to protect dangerous men. Churches debated sermons on the problem of evil, and families installed small memorials for those who had vanished. The leather pouch, once evidence, became a talisman in retelling, then legend, then local lore. Travelers told hushed tales of a man who counted fingers like beads. Children dared one another to say his name. In academic circles, the Copeland account became a cautionary study, how social networks and the aesthetics of respectability can provide cover for systemic violence. Scholars pointed to the way economic incentives, river trade, plantation wealth, the thinness of law in frontier territories, created opportunities for predators and made the costs of vigilance bearable to many. But this framing did not satisfy those who had lost someone. For them, the loss had a rawness that theory could not soothe. Over time, the story shifted between moralizing and myth. Some historians insisted on treating Copeland as uniquely monstrous. Others insisted he was an extreme case inside a larger pattern of violence that touched many frontiers. Both positions contained truth and blind spots. What remained clear to everyone was the human cost, the small, salted fingers that no one could forget, and the knowledge that a neighbor's face could hide a ledger of atrocity. Some reforms followed, patrols increased, records were kept more carefully, and county officials developed stricter vetting for river pilots. But reform is often piecemeal. Many practices remained. Elizabeth married later to a quiet man and rarely spoke of James, while Judge Hartwell retired into a brittle silence, his reputation forever stained. The valley bore a memory that shaped conversation for generations, and the children grew wary. The Copeland story functions as a study in how communities manufacture blindness. There are structural systems that encourage not seeing economic incentives, reputational investments, the comfortable assumption that people we know are essentially like us. These are not accidental failings, they are built into social life. Copeland exploited those systems like an engineer finds stress points in a bridge. He wore respectability as armor, while the network of trust around him acted as a shield for his impulses. That is the first and most important lesson. Evil often moves in the intervals where we assume the best of one another. The second lesson concerns ritual and obsession. Copeland's fingers were not mere trophies, they were components in a psychological architecture that allowed him to distance himself from the humanity of his victims. Preserving a digit in salt made the deed legible to him in an entirely different language. A language of control and accounting. The act of cataloging removed the fuzziness of moral struggle and converted it into a ledger of actions with consequences that he believed he could manage. The third lesson is institutional law and church by themselves will not root out evil if they are complicit or inattentive. The case forced local officials to reconsider how respectability and reputation can be twisted into protective covers. Reform of such systems demands not only better patrols, but a cultural willingness to ask uncomfortable questions of one another. That is inconvenient because it implies that neighbors may bear culpability through silence or turning away. The psychological elements of control are familiar small acts. Smiling, offering help, volunteering for searches, can cultivate trust, and then that trust can be weaponized. Copeland practiced identity work. He cultivated a public self that absorbed suspicion and a private self that disassembled people. Understanding this split is essential for broader prevention. Finally, the affair offers a caution about narratives. The comfortable story that punished one villain and restored a community obscures the deeper failures that let him operate. If a history only seeks closure, it risks missing how complicity and blind spots sustain horrors. Those are the forbidden lessons the river keeps if you are willing to listen. To resist such patterns requires deliberate listening, community transparency, and the courage to question reputations. It requires institutions to value uncomfortable truths over comforting myths, and for neighbors to prioritize vigilance over convenience. Elizabeth Hartwell's life after the trial is a study in how people carry the weight of betrayal. She survived public curiosity and private rumor alike, but survival did not mean freedom from the scene of grief. Those who know betrayal do not simply resume daily chores, they rearrange themselves around absence. Elizabeth married again, to a man of steady temper, but marriage did not erase the memory of how trust had been weaponized. She visited churches less often and wrote to family with an economy that suggested long reasoning and small, careful omissions. In quiet moments she would recall the early days, the ease of conversation with James, and the small gestures that had once charmed her. She could not reconcile that intimacy with the ledger of fingers and the stories of cruelty. Her faith communities tried to help by turning the case into moral lessons. Sermons on vigilance and the need for charity. But charity alone could not mend the sharp edges of what had happened. For the families of victims, healing came piecemeal. Some found solace in small rituals, reading a name aloud, planting a tree, attending a memorial. Others could not find closure and spent years caught in legal and personal disputes. The conversation between public commemoration and private grief is always unequal. Public rituals aim for closure while private loss keeps a more jagged rhythm. Over time, Elizabeth became a quiet presence at local memorials, a woman who understood how close proximity to evil could be. She bore the contradiction of having loved a man who could also inflict such harm, and that contradiction became part of her public testimony. Not a defense of the act, but a warning about the fragility of trust. In the years afterward, she worked modestly to support victim families, attending meetings, and offering what little comfort she could. It was not enough to erase the ledger, but these gestures taught the valley a small, necessary lesson: keeping memory alive is not only a duty to the dead, but a guard for the living. Her life became a quiet testimony that ordinary affection can mask monstrous intent, and that communities must balance hospitality with a skeptical attention to behavior that sits oddly against someone's character in practice. The Copeland affair did not create change overnight, but it bent public policy in modest ways. County authorities, shaken by the revelation that a man among them had been both neighbor and predator, invested in better records, stronger communication with adjacent jurisdictions, and renewed emphasis on patrols that took the swamp's geography into account. Private boat captains and merchants began to adopt simple precautions: document manifests more precisely, travel in groups, and report anomalies without assuming another man's reputation guaranteed safety. These changes were practical and limited. They did not solve the deeper social dynamics at play, but they made a certain kind of opportunistic predation harder to perform. The real shifts were cultural and slower. Conversations about how social standing can mask capacity for violence became less taboo. People grew more willing to ask pointed questions and to listen to the uneasy testimony of neighbors. That shift, incremental as it was, changed the tenor of public life. It introduced friction into social interactions, a beneficial friction that made exploitation costlier. The historians who later examined the case argued that such cultural shifts are more durable than the momentary spectacle of punishment. A more vigilant community creates fewer opportunities for predation, yet vigilance also carries risks. It can calcify into suspicion, and communities must guard against turning people into permanent suspects. This is the precarious balance of civic life. The Copeland story thus became, in some circles, a paradigm: how to balance mercy and prevention, hospitality and suspicion, forgiveness and accountability. The proper response, most argued, was not to cultivate constant fear, but to build institutions and norms that reduced both the motive and the opportunity for such crimes. That meant better law enforcement, yes, but also stronger civic education, community oversight, and a cultural willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, even when those truths implicated respectable men and secure reputations. The lesson is as relevant now as it was then. A community must choose whether to preserve comfortable myths or to bear the harder labor of honesty. Over generations, the story entered both grave commemorations and tawdry folklore. Descendants wrestled with shame and curiosity, sometimes eager to erase the association, sometimes compelled to keep the story alive as a warning. Tourists whispered about the finger farmer, and local historians pieced together archival fragments, insisting that remembering was an obligation to the vanished and to prevent similar darkness returning. To study Copeland is to study a microcosm of psychological manipulation. He was an architect of identity disruption. He stole not merely property, but the markers that make people legible to communities. Removing a finger is a brutal act of denaturing. A name is harder to match, kin harder to locate, and the state's ability to produce narrative is impaired. But the psychology beneath this is deeper. Copeland recognized that institutions rely on signals, rings, papers, testimonies. When those signals are removed or scrambled, the institutional machinery slows, and that delay is where predators find room to act. His trophies, the preserved digits, functioned as both evidence and a talisman. A private knowledge of the fragility of identity. The ritual of preservation turned violence into a form of record, keeping that only he could read. This is a form of dark knowledge. techniques and rituals that make cruelty legible and manageable to the perpetrator while remaining opaque to the community. It echoes older forms of corruption where rule and ritual are inverted to serve private gain. The historical danger here is not simply individual pathology, it is the structural allowance for asymmetric harm. When cultural norms allow men to hide behind reputation, to dismiss disquiet as gossip, and to place a premium on appearances, the costs of turning a blind eye are diffuse and easy to bear. That diffusion is the institutional corruption the story diagnoses. Copeland's actions also speak to how identity can be weaponized from within. He performed local rituals of neighborliness, tending fences, attending services, supporting neighbors, while simultaneously dismantling the identities of the vulnerable. His duplicity is the core lesson: evil need not wear monstrous clothing. It can dress in the robes of normalcy and thereby avoid scrutiny. Understanding this is not merely academic. It requires communities to examine how their own practices, who they choose to trust, what habits of silence they maintain, can create the conditions for such harm. Only by converting uncomfortable questions into everyday governance can a society hope to constrain the dark knowledge that allows predation to flourish. Modern readers should see echoes in any system where reputation outsizes accountability. Institutions must prioritize transparency over convenience. Communities should hold rituals of remembrance and review of their practices, ensuring that hospitality does not become a shield for predators, and that memory remains an active guard against repetition. If you have listened this far, the story has already begun to rearrange something inside you. Stories of forbidden acts are not merely entertainment, they are mirrors that show where we might be susceptible to similar patterns. Consider this a lesson in internal vigilance. Examine the ease with which you accept someone's reputation as sufficient explanation. Attend to the small silences in your community. Watch which questions are taboo. This is not a call to paranoia, it is an invitation to discernment. When communities normalize certain evasions, explaining away discomfort to preserve social cohesion, they create room for predation. The Copeland case teaches that transformation begins with attention and the courage to speak when something feels off. Think of the friends you trust and the rituals you attend. Do you assume safety because people are known or because they have given reasons to be trusted? The cost of assuming the former can be great. The narrative also asks a more intimate question: what do we collect to make ourselves feel powerful? Copeland collected fingers, others collect secrets, silence, or influence. Each is a currency that can be spent to secure control. Conversion of appetite into action is the most dangerous move. It is where fancy becomes behavior and private thought becomes public harm. Learn the grammar of that change. Practice small acts of accountability. Name a concern to someone trusted. Support transparent norms in institutions you belong to, and keep the memories of victims active in your conversation. Change does not require heroics, it requires steady, small refusals to accept convenient myths. As you leave this story, take a breath and let it settle. What partial truths will you no longer tolerate? What stories will you retell differently? The veil of ignorance is thin, pull at it gently, and see what hides behind. Your willingness to notice and to act in small ways can make a community less hospitable to those who would turn kindness into cruelty. Begin by creating regular spaces where uncomfortable details are aired without ridicule. Insist that organizations you belong to create simple grievance pathways. Resist quick moral simplifications that turn complex harm into tidy stories. Teach children to name feelings and discrepancies. Support local historical work that preserves victims' names. These are ordinary practices that, repeated, form a culture resistant to predation and devoted to refusing the comfort of easy explanations and practice. When historians return to episodes like Copeland's, they often face a tension between fascination and moral labor. It is easy to be intrigued by the grotesque detail, the salt, the leather, the trophies, and to lose sight of the human cost, the empty chairs, the hushed births that followed, the anniversaries known only to the families. Good history resists the spectacle and presses toward understanding the conditions that permitted such horrors. That means asking hard questions about social networks, economic incentives, and the complacencies that allow reputations to act as cover. It means measuring how law and religion interacted, sometimes in cooperation and sometimes in mutual self-protection, in ways that reduced accountability. It also means keeping the victims at the center of the narrative, remembering not only the sensational objects, but the people whose futures ended in a small, private violence. The ledger of fingers is a horrifying artifact, but the true ledger is social mapping, who benefited from ignoring signs and which structures made it costly to speak truth. In public memory, Copeland's story functions as a warning about the thinness of civility when it is used as a shield. For individual listeners, it functions as a mirror, to ask where we are willing to trade the discomfort of inquiry for the comfort of myth. The deeper, more unsettling lesson is this: evil rarely arrives as a thunderclap. It accumulates in margins, moves through routines, and finds lodging in the ordinary gestures we grant one another. To resist that accumulation requires more than legal punishment. It requires everyday practices that make suspicion organizational and remembrance communal. Keep the names alive. Speak of the missing not as cautionary tales, but as citizens who once belonged to a civic fabric they could not hold. If you learn nothing else from these pages, let it be this: attention matters. When communities pay attention, they change the arithmetic of harm. Look at the river when you pass it not as a scenic boundary, but as a ledger that remembers. It keeps a slower record than headlines do. Its currents will carry names and relics long after our models and our laws have moved on. If memory is the only insurance against repetition, then telling and retelling are acts of civic defense. Let these stories be our steady watches, rituals that accumulate into a culture that refuses repeat harm. Now, as our story closes, the river remains. It moves without malice, indifferent to the human calculus played along its bank, yet it preserves the echoes of what men have done upon it. The leather pouch, the salted tips, the names uttered in churches. These are marks in the river's long ledger. They are reminders that the domestic and the monstrous can inhabit the same hands, that a neighbor's face can conceal a ledger of cruelty. If your identity has shifted at all while listening, it is because you have been asked to carry a small responsibility, to see a little more clearly, to accept a little more discomfort, and to let that discomfort guide modest action. Not all stories end in neat redemption, and not every villain yields an answer that comforts. Some histories are punitive and stubborn. They demand that we live with the knowledge of what occurred and the questions it forces upon us. But living with knowledge is preferable to living in a complacent myth. There is a slow justice in acknowledgement, in the practice of remembering. If you carry the names and the images, you convert spectacle into guardianship. Let memory be an instrument that shapes vigilance rather than a curiosity that numbs. In the quiet that follows this narration, you might imagine the Copeland farm as an ordinary place where choices were made and then hardened into habit. Imagine the fingers small and precise, wrapped in cloth and salt. Grotesque perhaps, but also precise instruments of power that taught their keeper how to measure the world. That is the most piercing lesson. Cruelty can be administrative, and accountability must be equally methodical. Leave this story not as a grotesque entertainment, but as a manual of moral expense. A ledger you consult the next time you find yourself choosing ease over inquiry. Let the river's memory be your cue to act on the small promptings that bother you. Name what is strange. Ask for clarification. Keep the missing in mind. When you do these small things, you will have honored the vanished more than any marquee punishment ever could. The river will flow on, but your attention may bend the current of the days to come. Remember that. Carry this story like a quiet lantern in your pocket. Let it light the corners you might otherwise glance past and forget from now.